At 9:47 on the morning of February 9th, 1942, Kyle Rask sat at his desk in room 407 of the State Department building in Washington and read a sentence that would either condemn him or save his career. The sentence was written in Japanese in careful vertical columns on thin rice paper that had been flattened between the pages of an intelligence file. It said, "We are waiting for the day when the sun of our true home rises over the waves." Rask had been a translator for 15 years. He knew what the sentence meant. He also knew what it could be made to mean. The letter had been intercepted 3 weeks earlier from a shopkeeper in San Pedro, California, addressed to his brother in Yokohama. Most of it was harmless. Weather, business, the price of fish. Then this line, set apart from the rest, like a prayer. Rask underlined it with his pencil and turned to the yellow legal pad on his left. He wrote in the block letters, "Subject expresses desire for Japanese military victory, and states continued allegiance to Emperor pending outcome of war." He stopped. He read what he had written. It was not what the original said. The original said something softer, something about longing and belonging. But the original was in Japanese, and the men who would read his translation did not speak Japanese. They would read only what he gave them. He crossed out the sentence and tried again. Subject expresses nostalgic attachment to Japan and symbolic identification with national imagery. That was closer to the truth. It was also useless. His section chief, Robert Whitman, had been clear 3 days ago when he brought the box of intercepted letters into this room and placed it on the desk between them. "We need language that works in a legal context," Whitman had said, "not an academic seminar. These letters are going into a document that will be read by the Attorney General, by representatives from the War Department, and possibly by the President. They need to understand what kind of risk we are managing." Rask had asked what kind of risk Whitman meant. Whitman had looked at him for a long moment before answering. "The kind where 100,000 people of Japanese ancestry are living on the West Coast with access to ports, naval facilities, and military roads, and we have no reliable way to know who among them might provide assistance to an enemy invasion force. The kind where we lost half the Pacific Fleet 3 months ago and cannot afford to lose California." Rask had nodded. He understood the argument. He also understood that the argument depended on evidence and that he was being asked to provide it. Now he sat with the letter in front of him and the legal pad beside it, and tried to find a version of the truth that would satisfy both his conscience and his instructions. The sun of our true home. In Japanese, the phrase for true home was a compound that carried emotional weight. It meant the place your ancestors came from. It couldn't mean the place you would return to when you died. It did not necessarily mean the place you served in war, but it could mean that, if you wanted it to. He picked up his pencil again and wrote a third version. Subject expresses hope for restoration of Japanese power and identifies emotionally with Japan as primary homeland. The phrase suggests divided loyalty. He stared at the last 4 words. Suggests divided loyalty. He had added them himself. They were not in the letter. But they were, he told himself, a reasonable interpretation of what the letter implied. And if he did not write them, someone else would. There was a knock at the door. Rask folded the legal pad closed and said it was open. Whitman stepped inside, holding a cup of coffee and a file folder under his arm. He closed the door behind him with his foot, and placed the folder on the desk next to the box of letters. "Morning," Whitman said. He did not sit. "How far have you gotten?" "I am working through the first batch," Rask said. "There are some that are clearly problematic. References to the emperor. Praise for military actions. Others are harder to categorize." Whitman sipped his coffee and looked at the open letter on the desk. "What is hard about that one?" he asked. Rask hesitated. "The language is ambiguous. It expresses attachment but does not explicitly state disloyalty to the United States." "Does it explicitly state loyalty to the United States?" "No." "Then it is not ambiguous," Whitman said. "It is just incomplete. You are filling in the incomplete parts. That is your job." He opened the folder he had brought and took out a typewritten memorandum. He placed it in front of Rask. The heading read, "Summary of Naval Intelligence Assessment, West Coast Vulnerability, January 1942. "Read the second paragraph," Whitman said. Rask read silently. The paragraph stated that there were credible concerns about signaling from shore to Japanese submarines, about sabotage at shipyards, about information being passed through civilian channels to enemy contacts. It noted that investigation was difficult because of language barriers and because many individuals of Japanese ancestry maintained cultural and familial ties that could not be easily monitored. "They cannot monitor the ties," Whitman said, "but we can. That is why this work matters. We are not making policy. We are giving policymakers the tools they need to act responsibly." Rask looked up from the memorandum. "And if the tools are not accurate?" Whitman met his eyes without blinking. "They are as accurate as the situation allows," he said. "You are translating letters written by people whose country of ancestry is at war with us. You are not translating love poems. Every phrase you render has a context, and the context is that we are 3 months into a war we are losing. If you're unsure whether a phrase suggests loyalty to Japan or simple homesickness, you will resolve that uncertainty in favor of caution. Caution means we assume the worst until proven otherwise." He finished his coffee and set the empty cup on the edge of the desk. "I need your draft by Thursday," he said. 10 pages, examples with direct quotes, clean English that does not require a law degree to understand. If you find anything that refers to military matters, communications with Japan, or organization among Japanese communities, flag it separately. Those go to a different office." Rask nodded. Whitman turned to leave, then stopped with his hand on the doorknob. "One more thing," he said. "Do not overthink this. You are not responsible for what happens after the document leaves this room. You are responsible for making sure the document is clear, factual, and useful. That is all." He left. The door clicked shut. Rask sat without moving for nearly a minute. Then he pulled the legal pad open again and looked at the sentence he had written. Subject expresses hope for restoration of Japanese power and identifies emotionally with Japan as primary homeland. The phrase suggests divided loyalty. He drew a line through suggests and wrote indicates. Indicates divided loyalty. The change was small. It was also final. Suggests left room for doubt. Indicates did not. He moved to the next letter. This one was from a woman in Fresno to her parents in Osaka. She wrote about her children, about the difficulties of running a farm, about neighbors who had stopped speaking to her after Pearl Harbor. Near the end she wrote, "They look at us now as if we were strangers, but we know who we are and where we belong." Rask read the sentence twice. It was defensive. it was also human. A woman whose neighbors had turned against her was asserting that she still had dignity and identity. That was all. But the phrase, "where we belong," could be read differently. It could be read as a statement that her belonging was not in America. And if it was read that way, it became evidence of something larger. He wrote on the legal pad, "Subject acknowledges separation from American community and affirms primary identification with Japanese nationality." He paused. The word nationality was his addition. She had not written it. But she had written "where we belong," and in the current climate, that phrase would be interpreted as a rejection of American identity, whether she meant it that way or not. By writing nationality, he was simply making explicit what others would infer. He told himself this as he moved to the next letter, and the next, and the next. By noon he had translated 14 letters and flagged 9 of them as containing language that indicated questionable loyalty. He had not fabricated anything. He had simply chosen, in each case, the interpretation that aligned with the purpose of the analysis. At 12:30 he went downstairs to the cafeteria, ate a sandwich without tasting it, and returned to his office. He worked through the afternoon without interruption. At 4 o'clock, a clerk brought an additional file with a note from Whitman clipped to the front. Priority material, include in summary. The file contained transcripts of conversations recorded in Los Angeles. Rask did not ask how the conversations had been recorded. He read through them quickly. Most were mundane. One was not. The transcript recorded 2 men discussing rumors of relocation. The first man said he had heard that the government might move all Japanese away from the coast. The second man replied, "If they do that, it will prove they never trusted us. And if they never trusted us, maybe we were wrong to trust them." Rask read the exchange 3 times. It was bitter, but it was not treasonous. It was the response of someone who felt betrayed. But the transcript had been sent to him with a priority designation, which meant someone higher up had decided it was important. He wrote on his pad, "Subjects express resentment toward U.S. government and suggest reciprocal withdrawal of trust, potential indicator of conditional loyalty." He finished the draft at 6. The building had emptied. He could hear his own breathing in the silence. He gathered the pages, numbered them, and clipped them together. 10 pages, 32 examples, each one phrased in language that could be quoted in a meeting or printed in a briefing book. He placed the draft in a folder and wrote on the tab, "Linguistic analysis of correspondence, Japanese population, West Coast." Below that, he added his name and the date. He opened his desk drawer to file the folder for the night. As he did, he saw one letter he had set aside earlier and not yet translated. It was near the bottom of the stack, shorter than the others. He pulled it out. The letter was written in simple Japanese by someone whose handwriting was not practiced. At the top it said, "To Father, from Ken." Rask read it slowly. The writer explained that he had joined the United States Army. He said he wanted to prove that he was loyal, though he did not say to whom. He told his father not to worry. At the end he wrote, "If they send you away, I will come in uniform and bring you back." Rask sat with the letter in his hands. The son had enlisted in the American military. The son had written to reassure his father. The son had promised to protect his father from the very government whose uniform he now wore. It was loyalty and betrayal in the same sentence. He placed the letter face down on the desk. He did not translate it. He did not add it to the summary. He simply left it there, and then he put the draft folder in his drawer, locked it, and picked up his coat. At the door, he looked back once at the desk. The letter was still there, a small square of paper in the circle of yellow light from the lamp he had forgotten to turn off. He walked back, switched off the lamp, and left the room in the darkness. Chapter 2, rewritten. On October 23rd, 1945, Kyle Rask received a telephone call at his office from a lawyer he had never heard of. The lawyer introduced himself as James Purcell from the American Civil Liberties Union in San Francisco, and said he was representing a group of Japanese Americans who were filing a lawsuit against the federal government for unlawful detention. He needed to ask Rask some questions about a document that had been prepared in February of 1942. Rask said he did not recall the specific document. Purcell said he was certain Rask would recall it once they spoke in person. He asked if Rask would be available to meet the following afternoon at 2 o'clock. The meeting would take place in a conference room at the Justice Department, which Purcell said had agreed to provide space for preliminary depositions. It was not a trial. It was simply an opportunity to clarify certain facts. Rask asked if he was required to attend. Purcell said that technically he was not required, but that a formal subpoena could be arranged if necessary. He suggested it would be easier for everyone if they simply had a conversation. Rask agreed to the meeting. The next afternoon, he walked from his office to the Justice Department building 3 blocks away. The day was cold and overcast. He wore his coat and carried a briefcase that contained nothing except a notebook and 2 pens. He had not brought any files. He had not reviewed his 1942 correspondence analysis because he no longer had access to it. The document was classified and stored in an archive he could not enter without submitting a formal request that would take weeks to process. At the Justice Department, he gave his name to a receptionist who checked a list and directed him to a conference room on the 3rd floor. He took the stairs. The conference room door was open. Inside, 3 people were waiting. Purcell was younger than Rask had expected, perhaps 35, with dark hair and a narrow face. He wore a gray suit and sat at the far end of a long table, with a legal pad in front of him and a cardboard file box on the floor beside his chair. Next to him sat a woman in her 40s, with a short black hair and glasses. Purcell introduced her as Mrs. Hiraoka, one of his clients. On the opposite side of the table sat a man in a military uniform with a captain's insignia. Purcell explained that the captain was present as an observer on behalf of the War Department, which had an interest in the proceedings. Rask shook hands with Purcell and nodded to the others. He took a seat across from Purcell and placed his briefcase on the floor. There was a stenographer in the corner with a typing machine. Purcell asked Rask to confirm his full name and his position at the State Department for the record. Rask did so. Purcell opened the file box and removed a document. He placed it on the table and slid it across to Rask. "Do you recognize this?" Purcell asked. Rask looked at the cover page. It was a photocopy of the summary he had written in February 1942. His name was typed at the bottom. The title read, "Linguistic Analysis of Selected Correspondence, West Coast Japanese Population." "Yes," Rask said. "I prepared this document." "When did you prepare it?" "February of 1942. "And what was its purpose?" Rask hesitated. "It was an analysis of intercepted correspondence for use in policy discussions regarding national security." Policy discussions regarding the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast, Purcell said. I was not involved in policy decisions, Rask replied. I provided linguistic analysis. Purcell made a note on his legal pad. Let me read you a sentence from page 3 of your analysis. Subject expresses hope for restoration of Japanese power and identifies emotionally with Japan as primary homeland. The phrase suggests divided loyalty. Do you remember writing that? Rask looked at the document in front of him. He did not need to turn to page 3. He remembered the sentence. Yes, he said. What was the original Japanese text that you translated? Rask paused. I do not recall the exact wording. Purcell reached into the file box again and removed a second document. This one was a photocopy of a handwritten letter with Japanese characters visible on the left side and an English translation on the right. He placed it next to the first document. This is the original letter, Purcell said. It was written by a man named Takeshi Yamada from San Pedro, California, to his brother in Yokohama. The sentence you translated reads, in the original, we are waiting for the day when the sun of our true home rises over the waves. Until then, our hearts remain across the water. Rask looked at the letter. He recognized it. He had translated it 3.5 years earlier in room 407. Is that an accurate representation of the original text? Purcell asked. Yes. And is the English sentence you wrote in your summary an accurate translation of that text? Rask did not answer immediately. Across the table, Mrs. Hiraoka was watching him without expression. The stenographer's fingers were poised above the keys of the typing machine. It is an interpretation, Rask said finally. An interpretation, Purcell repeated. What is the difference between an interpretation and a translation? Translation involves rendering text from one language into another. Interpretation involves explaining the meaning of that text within a cultural and contextual framework. So you were not simply translating. You were interpreting meaning. Yes. And in your interpretation, the sentence about the sun and home and heart suggested divided loyalty to the United States. In the context of the time, yes. Purcell leaned forward slightly. Mr. Rask, the phrase true home in Japanese, how many meanings does it have? It can have several meanings depending on context. Can it mean simply the place where one's parents are buried? Yes. Can it mean the place one feels nostalgic for? Yes. Can it mean something other than political allegiance? Rask looked at the letter again. The handwriting was careful and even. The writer had taken time with each character. Yes, he said, it can mean something other than political allegiance. But you chose to interpret it as political allegiance. I chose an interpretation that was consistent with the security concerns of the time. Purcell made another note. Let me ask you about another sentence. Page 5 of your summary. Subject acknowledges separation from American community and affirms primary identification with Japanese nationality. What was the original text? Rask did not remember that one specifically. Purcell removed another letter from the box and placed it on the table. Rask read the Japanese text. It was from a woman in Fresno writing to her parents. The sentence said, "They look at us now as if we were strangers, but we know who we are and where we belong." Is that the text you translated? Purcell asked. Yes. Does the original use the word nationality? Rask looked at the characters. No. Does it say anything about identification with Japan as opposed to America? Not explicitly. Then where did you get the phrase primary identification with Japanese nationality? The room was quiet, except for the faint sound of traffic outside the window. The captain from the War Department was writing something in a small notebook. Mrs. Hiraoka had not moved. It was an inference based on the phrase "where we belong," Rask said. An inference, Purcell said. Based on your judgment about what the writer meant. Yes. Mr. Rask, do you speak Japanese fluently? Yes. Did you believe at the time you wrote this summary that these letters contained actual evidence of disloyalty to the United States? Rask felt something tighten in his chest. The question was simple, but it cut through everything else. He could answer it honestly, or he could answer it safely. He could not do both. I believed they contained language that required careful consideration in the context of wartime security, he said. That is not what I asked, Purcell replied. I asked if you believed they contained evidence of disloyalty. Yes or no? The stenographer's fingers moved across the keys. Rask looked at Mrs. Hiraoka. She was still watching him. Some of the letters contained concerning language, Rask said. Others were more ambiguous. Were the ambiguous ones included in your summary? Yes. And when you included them, did you present them as ambiguous, or did you present them as evidence of disloyalty? Rask did not answer. Purcell waited. I presented them in a way that emphasized the security concerns, Rask said, by interpreting ambiguous language as evidence of disloyalty. By interpreting language that could be read as problematic in the context of a national emergency. Purcell took out another document. Mr. Rask, I want to show you something. This is a letter written by a young man named Ken Yamada to his father in August of 1941, 4 months before Pearl Harbor. It was intercepted and included in the same batch of correspondence you reviewed. Do you remember this letter? Rask looked at the page. He did remember it. It was the letter he had set aside. The letter he had not translated. I may have seen it, he said. It does not appear in your summary, Purcell said. Why not? I do not recall. Let me read it to you in English, Purcell said. The writer says he has joined the United States Army. He tells his father not to worry. At the end he writes, if they send you away, I will come in uniform and bring you back. Do you remember that letter now? Yes? Why did you not include it in your summary? Rask looked at the table. It was not relevant to the analysis. It was not relevant that a Japanese-American man enlisted in the army and promised to protect his father from the government. It did not fit the scope of the assignment, which was to find evidence of disloyalty, which was to analyze correspondence for security-relevant content. Purcell closed the file and folded his hands on top of it. Mr. Rask, Ken Yamada served with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Italy. He was killed in action in October of 1944. His father, Takeshi Yamada, was interned at Manzanar Relocation Center in California. He died there in March of 1943 from complications of pneumonia. The letter you translated, the one about the sun and the true home, was one of the last letters he wrote before he was taken from his home. Mrs. Hiraoka was still watching Rask. Her expression had not changed, but her hands were folded tightly in her lap. Your summary was submitted to the Supreme Court as evidence supporting the government's position that Japanese Americans on the West Coast posed a security threat, Purcell continued. It was cited in legal briefs. It was referenced in congressional testimony. 112,000 people were removed from their homes based in part on analyses like yours. Do you believe your translations were accurate? Rask sat without moving. The stenographer was waiting. The captain had stopped writing. Mrs. Hiraoka's eyes were steady. I believed they were accurate within the parameters I was given, Rask said. That is the third time you have avoided answering the question directly, Purcell said. I am going to ask you one more time, and I would like a yes or no answer. Do you believe the translations you provided in February of 1942 were an accurate representation of the content and intent of the letters you reviewed? The room was silent. Rask thought about the letters. He thought about the phrase true home and the phrase where we belong and the sentence about the son in uniform. He thought about room 407 and Whitman standing in the doorway, saying that no one was asking him to decide anyone's fate. He thought about the man in the army uniform he had passed on Pennsylvania Avenue and the photograph of the barracks at Manzanar. No, he said. The stenographer's fingers stopped. Purcell waited. No, Rask said again. They were not entirely accurate. In what way were they not accurate? I emphasized certain interpretations and omitted others. I chose language that supported a predetermined conclusion. A conclusion that Japanese Americans were disloyal. A conclusion that there were grounds for concern about loyalty. And you knew at the time that your translations were not entirely accurate. Rask looked at his hands. They were shaking slightly. He pressed them flat against the table. Yes, he said. I knew. Purcell made a final note on his legal pad. Thank you, Mr. Rask. That is all I need for today. Rask stood. His legs felt unsteady. He picked up his briefcase and walked to the door. As he reached it, Mrs. Hiraoka spoke for the first time. My husband was at Manzanar, she said. Her voice was quiet and even. He died there in 1944. Heart failure. He was 46 years old. We had 3 children. They are American citizens. So was he. Rask stopped with his hand on the door. He did not turn around. I just wanted you to know, she said. He opened the door and left the room. In the hallway, he walked quickly toward the stairs. Halfway down, he stopped and sat on a step. The building was quiet. He could hear his own breathing. He sat there for several minutes. Then he stood, straightened his coat, and walked the rest of the way down. At the main entrance, he pushed through the doors and stepped into the cold afternoon air. He walked back to his office without stopping. At his desk, he opened the drawer where he kept his commendations and took out the framed certificate from the War Department. He looked at it for a moment, then placed it face down in the bottom drawer beneath a stack of files. He sat at his desk until the building began to empty. Then he put on his coat, picked up his briefcase, and went home. Kyle Rask retired from the State Department in June of 1962 at the age of 60. He moved to a small house in Silver Spring, Maryland, and lived alone. For 28 years, he taught English part-time at a community college, read the newspaper each morning, and took long walks through his neighborhood. He did not marry. He did not keep in touch with former colleagues. When letters arrived asking him to provide testimony about his wartime work, he placed them in a drawer and did not respond. In 1988, when the government issued formal apologies and reparations to Japanese Americans who had been interned, he saw the announcement on television and turned it off. His life had narrowed to a routine that required nothing from him except silence. On October 17, 1990, a letter arrived at his house with no return address. The envelope was postmarked from San Jose, California. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note at the top that said, "I thought you should know." Below the note was a photocopy of an obituary from a California newspaper. The obituary was for Emiko Hiraoka, who had died at the age of 87. She was survived by 2 children, David and Margaret, and 4 grandchildren. The text noted that she had been interned at the Poston War Relocation Center in Arizona during World War II, where her husband had died in 1944. After the war, she had worked as a school teacher in San Jose for 30 years. She was remembered as a kind and dedicated educator. Rask read the obituary standing in his kitchen. Then he read it again, sitting at the table. He tried to remember when he had last thought about Emiko Hiraoka. It had been decades. He remembered the conference room at the Justice Department in 1945. He remembered her sitting across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her voice quiet, and even when she told him about her husband dying at Manzanar. He placed the obituary on the table and sat looking at it for a long time. That evening, he walked to the small park 3 blocks from his house and sat on a bench near the playground. It was empty. The air was cold and the light was fading. He stayed until it was fully dark, then walked home. At his house, he turned on the kitchen light and looked at the obituary again. The names of her children were printed near the end: David Hiraoka and Margaret Chen. They would be in their 60s now, perhaps older. He wondered if they knew about the deposition their mother had attended in 1945. He wondered if she had told them about the man who translated the letters that helped justify the removal of their family from their home. He sat at the table until after midnight. Then he went to the small desk in his bedroom and took out a pad of plain white paper and a pen. He returned to the kitchen, sat down, and placed the paper in front of him. He wrote at the top, "Dear Mr. Hiraoka and Mrs. Chen." He stopped. He looked at the names. He did not know if David Hiraoka still lived in San Jose, or if Margaret Chen lived nearby, or if either of them would want to hear from him. He crossed out the line and started again. "Dear David and Margaret." That seemed too familiar. He crossed it out. "To the children of Emiko Hiraoka." He stared at that for a moment, then drew a line through it and turned to a fresh page. He tried again. "Dear Mr. Hiraoka, my name is Kyle Rask. I worked for the State Department during World War II. I met your mother once in 1945. I am writing to express my condolences on her passing." He stopped. The word sounded hollow. Condolences. As if he were a stranger sending a polite note. He was not a stranger. He was the man who had mistranslated letters that were used to justify putting their mother behind wire. He crossed out the paragraph and started again on a new page. "Dear Mr. Hiraoka, I am writing to you because I believe you have a right to know something about the work I did in 1942. I was responsible for translating correspondence written by Japanese Americans on the West Coast. Those translations were used as evidence to support the decision to remove your family and thousands of others from your homes. I want you to know that the translations were not accurate. I chose interpretations that supported a predetermined conclusion. I knew this at the time." He stopped and read what he had written. It was true, but it sounded like a confession written to relieve his own guilt, rather than to offer anything useful to the people reading it. He crossed it out. He tried a 4th time. "Dear Mr. Hiraoka, My name is Kyle Rask. Your mother may have mentioned me. I met her in 1945 at a deposition regarding the internment. I want to tell you that I am sorry for the role I played in the decisions that led to your family's removal and your father's death. He stopped at the word death. Your father's death, as if his translations had killed the man directly. That was not accurate, but it was also not inaccurate. The man had died at Manzanar. The man would not have been at Manzanar if the government had not removed him. The government had used Rask's translations as part of its justification. The chain of causation was indirect, but it was real. He crossed out the paragraph. He sat staring at the blank page. Outside, a car passed on the street. The refrigerator hummed in the corner of the kitchen. The clock on the wall above the stove showed 1:15 in the morning. He started again. I am writing because I owe you an explanation. In February of 1942, I was assigned to translate letters written by Japanese Americans to family members in Japan. My instructions were to identify language that suggested disloyalty to the United States. I followed those instructions, and I chose translations that made ambiguous phrases sound threatening. I left out letters that contradicted the conclusion I was being asked to support. I did this knowing that my work would be used to justify removing people from their homes. Your mother told me in 1945 that her husband died at Manzanar. I have thought about that many times since. He stopped. He read the paragraph again. It was the closest he had come to writing what he actually meant, but it still did not say what needed to be said, which was that he was responsible and that he knew he was responsible, and that no amount of explaining the context or the orders he had been given could change that. He put the pen down and rubbed his eyes. His hand was shaking slightly. He had not noticed it before. He picked up the pen again and tried once more. Dear Mr. Hiraoka, I do not expect you to forgive me. I am writing only because I believe you should know that the intelligence assessments used to justify your family's internment were not honest. I prepared one of those assessments. I mistranslated letters intentionally to make them appear more suspicious than they were. I was told this was necessary for national security. I believed that at the time, or I told myself I believed it. I do not know anymore what I believed. I know only that I did it, and that people suffered because I did it, and that your father was one of those people. He stopped again. The words were piling up, but they were not getting closer to what he needed to say. They were circling around it. He turned to another page and wrote very simply, I am sorry. He looked at those 3 words. They were true, but they were also inadequate. Sorry was what you said when you stepped on someone's foot or arrived late to a meeting. It was not what you said when you had helped destroy a family. He crossed out the words. He tried again. I do not know how to explain what I did in a way that makes sense. I was 38 years old. I had been translating for 15 years. I was good at my work. When my supervisor told me that the country was at risk and that my translations could help protect it, I wanted to believe him. I chose to believe him. I made the translations fit the conclusion he wanted because that was easier than refusing. I told myself I was doing my duty. I told myself someone else would do it if I did not. I told myself many things. None of them were true. He stopped and read the paragraph. It was honest, but it was also self-absorbed. He was explaining himself to them when what they needed was not an explanation, but an acknowledgement that something had been taken from them that could never be returned. He put his head in his hands. The kitchen was very quiet. He could hear his own breathing. He picked up the pen one more time and wrote, "Your mother was a school teacher for 30 years. She touched the lives of hundreds of students. I read that in her obituary. I spent my career translating words, and I cannot find the right ones now to tell you how deeply I regret what I did. I cannot give you back your father. I cannot give your mother back the years she lost. I can only tell you that I knew what I was doing was wrong, and I did it anyway. And I have carried that knowledge for 48 years, and it has not made anything better." He stopped. He read the last sentence. "It has not made anything better." That was self-pity. His suffering, such as it was, had no relevance to theirs. He crossed out the last sentence, then he crossed out the entire paragraph. He sat with the pen in his hand and the blank page in front of him. He had written 7 attempts. None of them were right. None of them could be right, because there was no combination of words that could address what he had done. An apology assumed that forgiveness was possible. An explanation assumed that understanding was possible. Neither was true. He put the pen down and gathered the pages he had written. He counted them. 7 sheets, each covered with crossed out lines. He folded them once and stood up. At the sink, he took a match from a box on the windowsill, struck it, and held the flame to the corner of the first page. The paper caught and curled. He held it over the sink until the flame reached his fingers, then dropped it and let it burn out. He did the same with the other 6 pages, one after another, until all of them were reduced to black fragments in the sink. He turned on the water and washed the ashes down the drain. He returned to the table. The pad of paper was still there. The obituary was beside it. He picked up the pen and wrote at the top of a clean page, "Dear Mr. Hiraoka and Mrs. Chen." He stopped. He could not continue. He put the pen down and stared at the 2 lines of text. They were all he had managed to write that he had not crossed out. He left the page on the table and went to bed. The next morning he woke at 6:30, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. The page was still there with the 2 lines at the top. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked it up, folded it once, and placed it in the drawer where he kept the other letters he had never answered. He drank his coffee and read the newspaper. The obituary was still on the table. He read it one more time, then folded it and placed it in the drawer with the letter he had not finished. That afternoon, he walked to the park and sat on the same bench where he had sat the night before. Children were playing on the swings. Their parents stood nearby, talking and watching. He sat until the families began to leave and the light faded. Then he walked home. At his house, he turned on the kitchen light and stood looking at the table. The pad of paper was still there. The top page was blank now, except for a faint impression left by the pen from the page he had removed. He left it there.